with me. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. When I began to study Abhidhamma back when I was in Sri Lanka in 1972-73, Abhidhamma had the reputation of being dry, dull, pedantic, boring. I found it interesting, but I was wondering, how will anybody else in America find it interesting? But maybe it's some testimony to the inherent value of the Abhidhamma that so many people have come for this course. Or maybe it just has acquired a reputation as being sort of the really deep and mysterious and abstruse and esoteric Buddhist teaching. Okay, so over this Labor Day weekend, we'll be having this 3.5-day retreat on the Abhidhamma. And in most of the retreats, starting tomorrow morning, we will be going through the first 2 chapters of this work, which is called the Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma. The root text of this work is a little manual that was composed probably in Sri Lanka, 11th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, called Abhidhamma Sangha, which means something like a compendium of the subjects of the Abhidhamma. In the year 1993, I think actually 91, 92, based upon an old translation of that work, I, together with a number of Burmese monks, U Revata Soyador and U Silananda Soyador, composed this expanded explanation of the Abhidhamma Sangha. And so that resulted in this comprehensive manual of Abhidhamma. And so during these next 3 days, we'll be exploring the first 2 chapters of the Abhidhamma Sangha, which are concerned with mind or consciousness and the factors of mind, the mental factors. Hopefully in the future we'll have chance to go through, chapter by chapter, the other chapters, but it would be difficult to include more than 2 chapters over a 3-day period. In fact, it seems a bit over-ambitious, but we will try to complete it. But in this first talk this evening, what I want to do is try to give an account of the historical origins of the Abhidhamma, and then a kind of broad overview of what the Abhidhamma is trying to do. What is the direction, the purpose of the Abhidhamma project? Okay, first, the traditional view of the Abhidhamma is that the Abhidhamma was realized, this is the traditional Theravadan view, I should say. The traditional Theravadan view is that the Abhidhamma was realized, contemplated by the Buddha himself in the period right after his enlightenment. According to the records, after his enlightenment, the Buddha spent a number of weeks, probably according to most accounts 7 weeks, in the vicinity of the Bodhi tree, contemplating the Dhamma, the truth that he had realized. And so the question would have come up, what was the Buddha contemplating in such depth and detail over that period? And the Theravadins gave as one of the answers that he was contemplating the system or philosophy of the Abhidhamma as it's come down in the 6 books, 6 out of the 7 books of the Abhidhamma Pitaka. The 7th book, or it's actually in order, it's the 5th book, is a book of dealing with debates, doctrinal debates, which is ascribed to a monk named Moggalliputta Tissa, who lived during the time of King Asoka. So obviously that couldn't have been contemplated by the Buddha himself, who was living 2 centuries, a century and a half earlier. But the Theravadins say that the Buddha himself contemplated the Abhidhamma right after his enlightenment, contemplated it very much as it's come down to us in the books of the Abhidhamma. And then the Theravada traditional view is that in the 7th Rains retreat, after the Buddha began teaching, he made a trip up to one of the heavenly realms, a realm called the Tavatingsa heavenly realm, the heaven of the 33. And he taught the Abhidhamma to deities, devas, who would come from many different deva realms and from many different worlds to hear the Buddha teach the Abhidhamma. And according to this traditional account, the Buddha made the special recipient of the Abhidhamma teaching his mother, because his mother had died 7 days after the Buddha was born, and she was reborn in one of the heavenly realms. And so she came together with many other devas to hear the Buddha teach the Abhidhamma, and the Buddha directed the Abhidhamma especially to his mother. Okay, but then it's said that even though the Buddha was teaching in the Deva world, but still he had to sustain his body with food. And so each day the Buddha would descend from the heavenly realm down to earth to go on alms round and collect food for his day's meal. And at that time, he would meet with his chief disciple, the Venerable Sariputta, and he would indicate in summary form the essential principles of Abhidhamma that he had taught to the deities over the past day. And then when the Buddha gave the basic outlines to Sariputta, Sariputta was able to penetrate the Abhidhamma in detail and then work out the fully developed system that's come down to us as the collection of Abhidhamma texts. So this is the traditional Theravadan view, which I must say, quite frankly, is not accepted as literal truth by contemporary scholars, but rather contemporary scholars of Buddhist studies and of the different Buddhist traditions posit what I call a gradual evolution of the Abhidhamma. First, when we look in the canonical texts, so the sutta collections, like the Nikayas, we find that sometimes the word Abhidhamma is used. But what's interesting is that when the word Abhidhamma is used, it always occurs in a context in which monks are having discussions amongst themselves. We don't see anything said to the effect that the Buddha was teaching the Abhidhamma to the monks, but rather it's said that the monks on such and such occasion were engaged in a Abhidhamma discussion. And so this certainly can't refer to the technical system that we now call the Abhidhamma. But one explanation of the word Abhidhamma, the way it's used in reference to these discussion amongst the monks, is based on the Pali prefix abhi, even though the word Abhidhamma is known to all of you, but I'll just put it on the board. One use of the prefix abhi is in what's called a referential sense. This is a little technical in terms of Pali grammar. So by a referential sense, the word Abhidhamma would mean something like referring to the Dhamma, or simply about the Dhamma. Actually, about sounds like abhi, and so we say Abhidhamma is about Dhamma. So we could imagine that when the monks are conversing about the Dhamma, their discussion is called Abhidhamma talk, an Abhidhamma discussion. But it could also be the case that these discussions that were taking place among the monks came to concern a more detailed and a technical treatment of the Buddha's teaching than we find delivered by the Buddha himself. Because the Buddha is the founder of Buddhism, and his task is to propagate, to promulgate, to establish the basic principles of the Dhamma, to lay them out, to spread them widely. But as the monks would have examined the teachings, they would have, in their discussions, perhaps explored them in greater detail, in greater, developing more technical approaches to the understanding of the Dhamma. Just as, for example, when a speaker might give a Dhamma talk, then after the talk, there'll be a discussion amongst the students about his talk. And then as you discuss the talk, you start bringing out different implications, different layers of significance within the talk. If it's a good talk, if it's a bad talk, everybody just goes home and goes to sleep. Okay, so as these technical discussions began to emerge among the monks, they probably developed a kind of momentum of their own, so that they started to spin off and become more detailed, more technical, until a more elaborate way of understanding and explaining the Dhamma started to emerge. And we could see this as the nucleus or the seed for the emergence of a full-fledged Abhidhamma. Okay, the prefix abhi also has the meaning of distinct from. And so the Abhidhamma, probably as these technical discussions sort of emerged and evolved and became unified into systems in their own right, they came to be called Abhidhamma in the sense that this was a teaching distinct from the Dhamma. It's rooted in the Dhamma, and the Dhamma here would be the teaching that the Buddha gives in the Sutta Pitaka. But because the Abhidhamma treats of its subjects in much greater detail, it's considered a special branch of learning, something for the specialist, the doctrinal specialist. So a branch of learning which is distinct from the general Dhamma. So the general Dhamma is used for teaching, the general population, whether the population of monks, nuns, or lay followers. But the Abhidhamma is that distinct teaching which is more specialized, more technical, and requires a greater degree of expertise, one could say, in understanding the subtleties of the teaching. And then the prefix abhi also has the sense or the connotation of what is superior to, what is higher. And so in time, Abhidhamma came to be understood, at least in certain quarters, as a teaching which is superior to the teaching of the suttas, or a higher teaching than the teaching of the suttas. Of these two ways of understanding Abhidhamma, distinct from and superior to, I myself would lean towards distinct from rather than superior to, because the teaching, which I would say is more important to learn for one's practice, for one's life, for one's everyday conduct, is the teaching of the suttas. But the Abhidhamma is a teaching which will broaden one's understanding, which will cast a very intense light upon the teaching of the suttas. So when you come to the suttas from after undergoing the study of the Abhidhamma, then you can understand the principles in, I would say, in greater depth, and see how the different pieces of the teaching fit together into a comprehensive whole. Because we have to remember that the Buddha didn't lay down one vast, comprehensive system that embraced every aspect of his teaching. But the Buddha would travel from town to town, city to city, and he would always be teaching audiences. And when he's teaching audiences, he is tailoring or fashioning, shaping the teaching to fit the needs of the audience, the listeners, the people who are to be guided. So in one place, the Buddha might teach the Satipatthana Sutta for those who are disposed to Satipatthana. Another place, he might teach just basic morality, basic ethics for those who have to learn an ethical teaching. To another audience, he might give a discourse on the five aggregates. To others, he might explain might give a number of discourses on dependent origination. So how do all of these diverse teachings given over a 45-year period, how do the pieces of the puzzle fit together into one big picture? And so the Abhidhamma gives us a way to see how the different pieces of the teaching hang together as an integral whole. Okay, even though the Abhidhamma came to be what we call a distinct teaching, a teaching distinct from that of the suttas, but we can see the roots of the Abhidhamma already within the Sutta Pitaka. We could see certain tendencies in the suttas, tendencies which over time would have evolved in the direction of the Abhidhamma. One example of this, and what's interesting is that at least several of these suttas are spoken by Venerable Sariputta, who is historically strongly connected with the beginnings of the Abhidhamma. Okay, one such sutta is Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 28, called the Larger Discourse on the Simile of the Elephant's Footprint. And in the second part of this sutta, Sariputta takes consciousness as a basis, and he relates consciousness to the 6 sense bases, the 6 sense faculties, and the 6 kinds of sense objects. And then, within this relation between consciousness and the sense faculties, he also integrates the teaching on the 5 aggregates and the 4 noble truths. So this way of breaking a subject down into its constituents, then integrating them, the constituents with the constituents of another scheme, and then placing them into a larger framework. This is quite typical of the Abhidhamma method. Another sutta which again shows, which can be considered a seed for the evolution of the Abhidhamma, is Sutta number 111 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called the Anupada Sutta, which means, the title means something like each individual factor. And in the sutta, the Buddha first praises the wisdom of Sariputta, and then he explains how when Sariputta was training for his own attainment of enlightenment, he would enter into each of the jhanas, the meditative absorptions, and then beyond the 4 jhanas, the 4 formless attainments, and then beyond that, what's called the attainment of cessation. And he would analyze each of these meditative attainments into a bundle, or maybe better, a constellation of individual mental factors. So when he would enter the first jhana, he would see how the first jhana is composed of factors A, B, C, D, and it goes on to enumerate about 20 factors. And this is very similar to the method that we see in the first book of the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which is called the Dhammasangani. Another possible source or seed for the emergence of the Abhidhamma are certain suttas that we encounter in Majjhima Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya, maybe in Anguttara Nikaya. They are called Vibhanga suttas. Okay, the word vibhanga means analysis. And so the Vibhanga suttas are suttas which take a particular subject and then treat that subject analytically, more analytically than is usually done. For example, a sutta might take, in fact, an example is from the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter number 12, sutta number 2, the Paticca Samuppada Vibhanga, which takes the Buddha's basic formula of dependent origination and then takes each individual factor and analyzes or defines that factor, usually by breaking it down into its constituents. Again, we have a sutta which analyzes the 5 aggregates, a sutta which analyzes the 6 sense bases, the Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta, a sutta which analyzes the 5 or 6 elements, the dhatus, a sutta which analyzes the Noble Eightfold Path, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 5 spiritual faculties, the 4 noble truths, and so on. And so my conjecture, this is my own personal opinion, that the Abhidhamma could well have developed from an expansion of these Vibhanga suttas to the point where they started to form a body, almost a separate body of literature, which then became designated the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Okay, another indication in the suttas of a germ or a seed for the emergence of the Abhidhamma is the reference to a particular subject of learning which is called matikas. Yeah, the word matika, interestingly, it's based on the word mata, which means mother. Now, what does a mother do? Well, to become a mother, what does she do first? She gives birth to children. So, from one mother, there might come 2, 3, 4, 5, many children. And so the matika is, you might call it an outline of a teaching. Maybe outline is the best word. But it's a kind of outline that one can use as a basis for expansion and elaboration. So the matikas are outlines, lists of major doctrinal categories. For example, we have even something like the 4 Noble Truths, even itself is a kind of matika. So from the 4 Noble Truths, what are the 4 Noble Truths? My mind is getting rusty. Okay. Wait, let's get them in right order. Suffering, the cause or origin of suffering, the end of suffering, and the path to the end of suffering. Okay, now we can treat the 4 truths as a matika, giving birth to little children. Like we take the truth of suffering, and if you look at the sutta, often something like 11 or 12 aspects of suffering are enumerated. So we have birth, old age, sickness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair, separation from the loved, union with the unloved, not to get what one wants, the 5 aggregates. So a number of aspects included in the truth of suffering. How many aspects under the truth of origin? I heard 3. No. I mean, craving, yes, but no. How many aspects of the second noble truth, the truth of the origin of suffering? No. 3 is the right number. What are they? 3? No. Say again. No. Somebody in the back. You were very close, but then you dropped off. Okay. Let's give this gentleman a try. Okay. So it's the 3 aspects of craving. So craving for sense pleasures, craving for continued existence, craving for extermination or non-existence. The truth of cessation, we make it very simple, just 1. Then we have the 4th truth, the truth of the path. What is it? Noble Eightfold Path. But then each one of these steps becomes a matika. Right view, I'm not going to test you. The view of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path. Then right thought has 3 aspects: right speech, right action, right livelihood is very simple. Right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Each one you could pull out more things. And so you could fold them all into 4 truths, pull them out into 12 aspects of the first truth, 3 aspects of the second, 1 of the third, 8 of the fourth, and then from the 4th you pull out more aspects. And so when you start integrating lists like this, how does dependent origination integrate with the 4 noble truths? Tell me in 10 words or less. It's a joke question. Okay, so this matika became a basic element. They're mentioned in the suttas. It's said that there are monks who are masters of the Dhamma, who know the suttas, who know the vinaya, the discipline, and who know the matikas. And so knowledge of the matikas was one of the sort of marks of a learned monk. And then the concept of the matika becomes a basis for the unfolding of the Abhidhamma. In fact, the entire Abhidhamma Pitaka builds upon a matika, a very comprehensive list that we find at the beginning of the first book of the Abhidhamma. I'm going to come back to the matika in a little while. Okay, now I want to trace some continuities between the teachings of the suttas, the nikayas, and the Abhidhamma. First, the ultimate aim of the Buddha's teaching, of the Dhamma itself, the teaching that we find in expounded again and again in the suttas, is to gain liberation from samsara, from the cycle of birth and death. And according to the Buddha, Craving is the origin of birth and death. Craving is the root cause of continued migration in birth and death. But craving springs from a more fundamental root. And what is that more fundamental root? Ignorance, good. So, ignorance, not knowing things as they really are, not seeing things as they really are, this is what keeps us in bondage to craving, and it's the craving that propels us from life to life in samsara. And so, what is needed to overcome ignorance is a particular factor or mental faculty that's the opposite of ignorance. And what is that faculty that's the opposite? Wisdom, insight, knowledge, panya or jnana. Especially it's said to be yata bhuta, at least one of the expressions is yata bhuta jnana dasana, knowing and seeing things as they really are. So what is right knowledge, right cognition? In the suttas, it's defined or explained as knowledge of, at least one explanation, is knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. And it's said that even in the Buddha's first discourse, dukkha satyang parinyayang, that the truth of suffering is to be fully understood, the truth of the origin is to be abandoned, the truth of cessation is to be realized, the truth of the path is to be developed or cultivated. So this becomes, in a sense, the project of the Abhidhamma is to lay bare, first, the truth of suffering is explained. The Buddha enumerates various aspects of suffering, like I mentioned, birth, old age, and death. But when he really comes down and boils it to the essence, it comes out to be the five aggregates, the panchakanda, or panchaskanda, the five groups of bodily and mental factors that constitute what we call I, or myself. And so a task of the Abhidhamma is to provide a detailed analysis of the truth of suffering, understood as the five aggregates or as the full collection of bodily and mental phenomena. Another of its aims is to identify and show in detail the nature of the mental defilements that keep us in bondage. And still another project of the Abhidhamma is to lay bare and to expound the different groups of practices that one has to cultivate to gain liberation. So these are the practices that are usually grouped into put together or compiled into the 7 groups, which constitute the 37 aids to enlightenment, another matika. What are the 37 aids to enlightenment in 7 groups? Let's get them in order. Then you can't answer. Is that Mahendra in the back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. Noble Eightfold Path, 7 factors of enlightenment.
We have to get them in order.
Okay, we can start that one. 4 Satipatthana.
Okay, 4 foundations of mindfulness.
4 right efforts,
4 right efforts, very good.
4 iddhipadas,
Yeah, 4 bases of spiritual power.
5 faculties,
Right, the 5 spiritual faculties,
5 powers,
the 5 spiritual powers.
7 factors of enlightenment, and Noble Eightfold Path.
Right, very good, excellent. 7 factors of enlightenment. I'm not going to ask, this isn't a class on the 37 factors of 37 aids to enlightenment. But you could say that in exploring the teaching in detail, one would want to get a kind of detail, or exploring the teaching in depth, we would want to get a detailed analysis of these 37 aids to enlightenment. What are they? And then especially, how do they relate? You know, are the 4 foundations of mindfulness something different from the Noble Eightfold Path? Different from the spiritual faculty of mindfulness? So this is a kind of one of the things that's dealt with in the Abhidhamma, is to show how these different lists fit together. Okay, but while we find these teachings in the suttas, the Abhidhamma tries to be more detailed and systematic. More, on the one hand, it's more theoretical, but also more comprehensive. So what it is trying to do is to establish a theoretical model, or what we can call maybe a panoramic picture, that can accommodate all the factors of experience, but organized according to the aims of the Buddha's teaching itself. What are the factors of experience that are to be fully understood? What are the factors that are to be eliminated and abandoned and purified? And what are the factors that are to be developed and cultivated in order to achieve the ultimate aim of the teaching, which is Nibbana, the deliverance from birth, old age, and death?